Well, I feel this has already been so rich, so we're going to hopefully go from glory to glory. But I really appreciate the introduction, the land acknowledgement, and thank you so much for hosting us here. And I'm going to be advertising. There's a fish fry right next to him. And everybody's going to get hungry, and everybody should go, help out. I bet it's a youth group or something like that. Listen, as someone who's done my time in pastorship, I'm saying go support the kids. Anyway, I'll just say I am really delighted to be here this weekend and with this whole community to dive into the Interfaith Scholars Weekend. I am grateful to the respondents who I will be in conversation with today. I'm really looking forward to learning from you and being part of a broader conversation. I want to thank all the groups that were involved in making this happen. And so just really appreciate everyone who was involved and with the Interfaith Alliance in Central California, of course. But there's one person I just want to single out, and that's this guy right here. Who is the chair for the Big College Weekend. He has been an incredibly gracious, tireless. Yeah, there we go. That's what does that happen to you often? Where someone does that to you? I mean, that's like a very lovely.
I'm there every time I'm anywhere.
Yeah, anywhere. That's the kind of greeting. Anyway, I'm very grateful to you. You've been so lovely to work with. So thank you, and so just broad thanks overall. I come this evening to share words of solidarity, of support, of hope for this community, and I'm eager to listen and learn about what's happening here in this community and hopefully join you in casting a vision for a truly diverse, welcoming, and hopeful Central California where everyone from every background is understood to have inherent dignity and is afforded equal treatment under the law. Walter Cronkite, who was the honorary chair of the Interfaith Alliance Board of Directors for over a decade, was fond of saying that our work was nothing less than the preservation of democracy. And those words resonate in 2023 as much as they ever have. So everyone in this room has an entry point for reflecting on where we come from, where we are today, and where we're going as a country. And I want to start my remarks with a bit of personal history to share with you how I entered this conversation about religion in America. My great-great-grandparents on my father's side came to the United States after the uprisings of 1848 across Europe that were also known as the People's Spring. Some of my great-grandparents lived in Vienna, some in Prague. All experienced the restrictions, taxations, and degradations that came from being Jewish in the Christian-dominated European continent. One of my Jewish ancestors was named Joseph Goldmark, who was a central figure in the revolution that took place in Vienna against the monarchy. And when the uprising was successful, Joseph was part of the first Reichstag in the history of Austria that was formed with an intent to represent the people. The government only lasted for 18 months before it was dissolved when the monarchy was restored to power. And Joseph was forced to flee as a refugee to America. But during that brief time, they passed several groundbreaking laws that included freedom for the serfs, freedom of the press and arts, as well as lifting the restrictions on the Jews. Unfortunately, when the People's Spring was crushed, the laws protecting the Jews were quickly nullified, and retribution in Vienna and Prague and across Europe against those who had participated in the uprising was severe, and in many cases specifically targeted the Jews that took part. So Goldmark, along with my other ancestors, the Dembitz family, the Whaley family, and the Brandeis family, picked up their lives and moved to America. Arriving on these shores, my ancestors experienced freedom previously unimagined for them. A place where they could have dignity for who they were, no matter what religious background they came from. The freedom of religion was truly amazing to them, and they wrote back to their family members in Europe expressing their love for their new country. Now, I'll pause here. Some of you are assuredly asking how these Jews had a descendant who was a reverend. But I'll save that story for another day. But the important thing is here is the freedom my ancestors experienced was not an accident. The founders of America were thoughtful and intentional about the role that religion would play in the country, and they ascribed that intention in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It simply could not be clearer. For anyone suggesting today that America was founded as a Christian nation, they are arguing against the Constitution. My Jewish ancestors arrived less than 6 decades after then President George Washington wrote his famous letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, assuring them equal status in the United States, telling Jewish congregants, all possess alike, this is a quote, all possess alike liberty of conscience, immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States give no bigotry, no sanction to persecution, no assistance to bigotry, no sanction to persecution, no assistance. And if we needed more proof that the founders did not intend the United States to be a Christian nation, the Treaty of Tripoli makes it explicit. How many in this room know what the Treaty of Tripoli is? I see one. Okay. Believe me, this is not a got you. It's just, this is unfortunately not a part of our history that we recognize. It was written by George Washington in 1796 to avoid war with Muslim nations over trade. The treaty was signed by John Adams and ratified unanimously by a Senate that was still half filled with signers of the Constitution. The treaty says, and I quote, "As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion," I'm going to say that one more time. This is the founders of our country. "As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religious, or tranquility of Muslim, what can you do? And as the states never had entered into any war or act of hostility against Mohammedan nations, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries." That's a treaty of the United States showing the intention. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, reinforced the First Amendment and coined the phrase, the separation of church and state, and showed his comfort with a diverse religious American nation by quipping, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to believe in 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." I mention all of these examples because the next time someone tells you that America was founded as a Christian nation, they are factually incorrect and intentionally misleading and rewriting history, attempting to superimpose a religious hierarchy onto a country that was founded intentionally to do just the opposite. As Princeton historian Kevin Cruz has written, despite the founders' intent, later generations of Americans began to assert that the country they created was indeed Christian. Now, claims of being a Christian nation have also come with an implicit white supremacy that really translates into a white Protestant nation. My family experienced freedom in their new country in part because in the mid-1900s, Jews of Northern Europe were granted status as white. However, the reality that they confronted was that a large portion of the population that was not white was also not free. Their religion was devalued and not considered American. The brutal institution of slavery that had been part of the same country that has espoused the values of freedom since the beginning Just a few years after my ancestors arrived, the Supreme Court decided in the odious Dred Scott case that upheld slavery and further ruled that because Mr. Scott was of African descent, he could not be a citizen and therefore had no right to sue. The toxic mix of racism and religious bigotry was apparent in the 1920s when the Ku Klux Klan marched down 50,000 strong the streets of Washington, D.C. against the full rights of Black Americans, Jews, and Catholics, explicitly threatening violence against them. In the 1920s, laws were passed to restrict immigration through a quota system that promoted immigration from Western and Northern countries to keep out the perceived dangerous influence of the Catholic and Jews from Eastern and Southern Europe. These laws were also used to restrict Muslim and Hindu populations from the Middle East and South Asia that have been growing in the country. Again, the aim was to restrict both non-white races as well as non-Christian religions. Also in the 1920s, the so-called prerequisite cases decided by the Supreme Court denied citizenship rights to a Japanese petitioner and a South Asian petitioner on the grounds that they were not white. A few decades later, in response to the perceived threat of atheist communism, the phrases "one nation under God" and "in God we trust" were introduced into the common language of America. In 1949, and again in 1954, the National Association of Evangelicals proposed a constitutional amendment putting God and Jesus in the nation's constitution. And they were defeated by a coalition of Christian and Jewish groups specifically. The effort to put God and Jesus in the Constitution only further underscores the fact that those words are not there to begin with, intentionally left out in order to avoid exactly what more recent Christians have tried to impose. And here's another point that's obvious but needs to be made. Religion is too often used for terrible means. A powerful strand of religion was instrumental in undergirding the white supremacy and sanctioning slavery. Religion professor Harry Stout of Yale University wrote, "White Christians in the South didn't just support slavery. The Southern Church was the backbone of the Confederacy. And in its attempts to keep African Americans in bondage, Southern clergy had no doubt that slavery was not a sin." This support of white supremacy and oppression of Black Americans continued after emancipation through Jim Crow and the battle over civil rights, and it continues on today. Religious claims from the 1600s were also inherent in the doctrine of discovery, used to legitimize the abrogation of rights and the takings of land from indigenous people for the last 4 centuries. The examples of religious support for slavery and continued support for white supremacy and the taking of indigenous lands across the continent and attacks on indigenous communities and their belief, often in the name of Christianity, is a necessary reminder that while freedom of religion is important, it is necessary. Religion itself is not de facto good. And so when we talk about freedom of religion, we have to pointedly ask, whose religion and whose freedom? The language of the First Amendment makes clear that freedom to believe as we choose is unalienable, but it is not unlimited. This freedom of conscience to believe what we want exists in a constellation of civil rights and civil liberties that ensure that every one of us can engage our democracy with equal dignity. How we engage one another is perhaps summed up in the legal truism, "Your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins." Which brings us to Christian nationalism. How's that for a segue? Christian nationalism. It's the most serious threat to the principle of religious freedom that we were founded upon, and it represents an existential threat to our democracy. Christian nationalists revel in denying the history and proclaiming our country a Christian nation that they conveniently remake in their own image. They are determined to impose the imprimatur of their narrow faith tradition upon the laws of the land, using the power of courts and government. And perhaps most dangerous of all, they use the rhetoric of a Christian nation with its underpinning of white supremacy, xenophobia, patriarchy, authoritarianism, to dictate who is a true American and who will be relegated to a perennial outside status, to be tolerated in just such a manner that George Washington declared should never happen. The goal of Christian nationalism is the establishment of a theocracy. As Catherine Stewart explained on my podcast, State of Belief, shameless plug, State of Belief podcast, Christian nationalism is an ideology. It is a political movement and a quest for power. Unfortunately, Christian nationalism is not relegated to the shadowless corners of our country. A poll recently released by Public Religion Research Institute and Brookings indicates that close to 30% of Americans are either adherents or sympathetic to Christian nationalism, and that among white Protestant evangelicals, that number jumps to nearly 2/3. Over 1 in 4 Americans believe the United States should declare itself a Christian nation. Not surprisingly, negative attitudes towards the rights of Black Americans, immigrants, Jews, Muslims, LGBTQ people, the role of women, are remarkably higher in the adherents and sympathizers to Christian nationalism than in the wider population. I can't go through all this. This is available online, so it's actually a really important research drop that happened 3 weeks ago. But just the attitudes on race. In the poll conducted by PRI, close to 80% of Christian nationalists disagree with the statement that generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for many Black Americans to work their way out of the lower class. The poll also shows that among avowed Christian nationalists who are white, 85% believe that discrimination against whites is as big a problem as discrimination against Blacks. No wonder Christian nationalists are behind the effort to ban African American studies programs. No wonder they don't want people to say gay. No wonder they are banning books. No wonder there is an increased anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and hate overall. No wonder they are treating immigrants like props and sending them up to New York and DC to score points. It's deeply grounded in a Christian nationalist worldview of how they want our country to look and act, and they're determined to get their way. A few other scary things, and then I'm going to get to the hopeful part. As Catherine Stewart recently wrote in the New Republic, Christian nationalists are increasingly framing their efforts as a spiritual battle that resonates with many of its followers from the more charismatic and Pentecostal traditions. Christian nationalism pits the power of Jesus, their side, versus the power of Satan. This is not only being preached in churches, mind you. More elected political figures are taking on this language. Governor Stitt of Oklahoma prayed after his re-election, "Father, we just claim Oklahoma for you. Every square inch, we claim it for you in the name of Jesus. Father, we can do nothing apart from you. We don't battle flesh and blood against principalities of darkness." What should a person think from another religious tradition or a different political view or no tradition? What is their standing when the highest official in the state is praying in such a way as to explicitly put them in a second-class status and also as spiritually opposed to the well-being of the state? Florida Governor DeSantis quoted Ephesians from the Bible when he claimed the mantle of God against all who would oppose him, saying during his campaign, "Put on the full armor of God, stand firm against the left's schemes." Now, you may or may not recognize that when you say the left, the Bible says devil, but he replaced them with the left. There are so many others, but these two governors are two of the highest placed officials in the country. And they are openly calling their opponents agents of evil, which puts politics into this zero-sum realm of spiritual warfare. Okay, one last piece of bad news, and then I promise. Part of the PRI poll asked this question. Because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. And Christian nationalists responded affirmatively at 7 times the rate of the rest of the population. Nearly 1 in 5 Americans assert that not only is the United States a white Christian nation, but also that they are willing to fight to preserve it. We've seen this. We saw this when the white Christian nationalists marched through Charlottesville with torches saying Jews will not replace us, or when President Trump used tear gas and violence on the protesters in Lafayette Square in order to hold up a Bible as a prop at St. John's Church, and of course, most notably on January 6, 2021, in the deadly attack in our nation's capital by insurrectionists holding crosses and waving Jesus banners as they attempted to thwart the will of the people in the election and subvert our democracy. So I hope we can recognize the wide disparity between the intentions of the founders of our country to create a nation that would be welcoming to people of every religious tradition and no religious tradition, and the claims and aims of Christian nationalism in the 21st century. Now here's the good news. As of now, Christian nationalism is very unpopular. 70% of Americans reject the calls to declare America a Christian nation. Close to 75% of Americans said they preferred a country made up of diversity of faiths, not just Christianity. 80% of Americans reject the idea that Christians should exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Christian nationalist views on race, gender, immigration, and LGBTQ people are also unpopular and as of now out of step with the American people. Demographic trends are also against Christian nationalism. The people who represent the core of Christian nationalism look a lot like me. Older, white, Protestant evangelical. I'm not Protestant evangelical, but I am Protestant. And all those categories are in decline in this country. Before the 2016 election, the head of PRI research, Robbie Jones, released the book, The End of White Christian America, which showed the decline of the Christian and white population and how America was becoming much more diverse in every way, including religiously, including the rise among the young of people who adhere to no faith tradition. So here's what's animating the Christian nationalist movement, and it's the most powerful and worst motivator. It's fear. Trump tapped into this fear with his backwards-facing MAGA motto in 2016, and just last week in CPAC, Trump warned his followers, this is the final battle. If we don't do this, our country will be lost forever. They've made their goal clear. They're attempting to hold on to power, and as the polling shows, they're willing to do just about anything to achieve it. And it's up to us to make sure that they're not going to be successful. And we're going to win. We are. I recently had the chance to interview Rabbi Sandra Lawson, who's a Black, queer, Jewish woman rabbi. And I asked her, what gives you hope in the face of your life lived at the intersection of so many identities under attack right now? She said, Paul, we've already won. I see the progress. I see we are no longer the same country my grandparents lived in. At the same time, bad actors keep trying to bring all that back. But I see progress is made, and we have so much further to go, but we're going to win. And I was shocked by her resilience and her positive worldview, but I appreciated the political strategy that it contained. We're going to stand up to Christian nationalism by naming it, by saying it's not what we want our country to be, and we're also going to win by casting a much more beautiful vision for this country, for our communities, for our city, for our nation, that invites everyone to participate with equal dignity for the people of faith and no faith to live their life freely. Together, we will celebrate an inclusive understanding of religious freedom and demand that our religious and moral and ethical commitments around racial equity, marriage equality, freedom of women, and public schools deserve equal treatment to those who claim the mantle of religion but mean it to benefit the very few. We will support the right to say, yes, anyone can believe anything they want, but that doesn't mean they can do anything they want. The right to swing their fist or their faith ends where our noses and our precious lives begin. InterFaith Alliance was formed almost 30 years ago specifically to counteract the outsized influence of the so-called moral majority who claimed that they represented the religious perspective and attempted to tell everyone that represented the religious view of the country. Since then, we have worked with people of over 75 different faith traditions, as well as secular and humanist groups, to offer an alternative vision of how an inclusive religious freedom can benefit a diverse democracy. A recent example was in the fight for marriage equality in Washington, where InterFaith Alliance helped to build a large coalition of religious groups that proclaimed marriage equality was part of our faith commitments and that we all deserve the right to love whom we choose. We specifically mobilized around the religious freedom amendments that were proposed by the bill's bipartisan sponsors, Senator Baldwin and Collins, and gathered support from many of the major religious traditions, including the Sikh community that came out strongly for marriage equality for the first time. Dick Durbin responded to claims from the far right that said that the marriage equality was anti-religious freedom by recognizing our letter as proof of the wide coalition that actually was very wide, that more closely represented the will of the American people, which poll after poll of religious Americans have supported marriage equality. This is just one example of a proactive mobilization that can and must happen in the country to defeat Christian nationalism. Part of the reason the Respect for Marriage Act was so important as a piece of legislation, it was clear that the Supreme Court could not be relied upon to protect a diverse democracy. We have to show up at school boards, at the voting booth, in our civic and religious spaces, and insist that America is for all of us, not just for some. We have to widen the circle of people who count in America, not restrict it. We cannot let anyone flatten the moral arc of this universe. Now, I am a religious person. I am a pastor. And I reject Christian nationalism because it corrupts my Christian faith and preaches a false gospel of bigotry and domination. I'm an American who loves my country and is grateful to this country for the safe haven it offered my family 175 years ago. And I love my country enough to want us to recognize our past, repair all that has been harmed, and commit to a future of America being a place of freedom for all people. I want to show up to defeat Christian nationalism by showing a wide inclusion and actually being a force of love, even for those Christian nationalists who may fear me or even hate me. In our movement, I want us to fight for everyone, including very conservative Christians, to be able to believe whatever they want and take their place in the mosaic of this nation. It is part of the definition of a democracy that we will live our lives alongside people with whom we will disagree. My deepest prayer is that we can invite people who think that Christian nationalism is the way they have to live out their Christian faith to join us in a wider circle of people of faith and no faith who truly want to live side by side with one another in mutual respect and understanding. Paul, I want to show up with my Jewish, Sikh, Indigenous, Muslim, Hindu, Jain, atheist, Christian neighbors, with all of you, to protect your right to believe as you choose. I want to be a part of a movement where religion shall be a bridge, not a bludgeon. I want to be a part of a movement where religion shall liberate, not subjugate. I want to be a part of a movement in a country where religion will be part of a diverse democracy, not a power grab for an exclusive theocracy. Tomorrow we'll be having a training on interfaith advocacy that leads on the best of the American traditions of diverse groups coming together to work side by side to make America better for all. I hope many of you will be joining us. At a recent training we offered in Dallas, Texas, a pastor stood up at the end of the day and told the group, "I feel less alone." And that is what I pray for here today, that we feel less alone, less isolated, and more equipped and inspired to show up for one another. The greatest example of interfaith advocacy in America continues to be the civil rights movement and the indelible image of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., influenced by Mahatma Gandhi, walking side by side with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. It brings me back to my great-grandfather in Vienna, who wanted freedom for himself and the wider Jewish community and was prepared to fight for it on the floor of the Reichstag. But when the time came for the discussion, it was his friend, a Catholic priest named Father Fuster, who stood up in 1849 and told the assembly why the Jewish struggle was his struggle. And he said, and I quote, "If we free the Jews, we free ourselves from the sway of Christian barbarism and of tyrannical Christian bigotry." So it was Christians who stood up for the Jews in Austria. That priest's liberation as a Christian was tied up in the work to free his Jewish compatriot from oppression. We can and we will show up for one another and for our democracy that needs every one of us. One of the sons of the Jewish families that came to America from Europe was my great-grandfather Louis Brandeis, who became the first Jewish justice of the Supreme Court. And while he had much to say about the power of the court and the politicians, his most sincere belief was encapsulated in this quote: "The most important political office is that of the private citizen." This is our time and our calling. Fellow humans, let's rise up and work together to ensure a welcoming, diverse, and just America that celebrates the many so that we might truly be one. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much looking forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say and learning more.
Thank you, Pastor Raushenbush, for this tremendous keynote starting off the weekend. When our committee worked up its plan for what would be the 3 days, we did propose certain things, and Paul responded very positively that he would have certain presentations, but there'd be moments when there would be a real effort of dipping into the community that we already have here with very strong leadership from all these diverse groups that Paul was mentioning. Different ethnicities, different traditions, different religions, and different non-religions. We're like so blessed. I'm going to let the Reverend have a chance, as he'd like. He'll be the last one to speak, to kind of wrap us up tonight, respond in any way he would like to the ones who presented things to him. And on that note,
well, I feel we have been very blessed already, and I am not going to take up much more of your time. I do want to thank each of you very much for those thoughtful contributions. I feel like the opportunity is to learn from one another. And, you know, I just especially you, my friend, who's is a Ken. I'm sorry, I don't have my friend Ken. You know, I think just helping us like get literally the landscape, the sacred landscape where we are, is such it just opens the mind, and it helps us realize, oh, okay, there's all sorts of ways to to go at this issue, and how can the more I learn help me incorporate the broader views into my work? And literally, as you were speaking, I was like, we need to do more. InterFaith Alliance National needs to do more. And I was like, how do we do more? And I was like, okay, we're going to come up with it. And I was like, no, just listen. We'll figure that out. But the opportunity here is to learn, to do more for one another. And hearing stories like that is just so important. So I want to thank you for that, all your stories and your information. Every time, I know you don't feel like you were preaching at me, but you were preaching to me. Because every time I hear all those stories from the Prophet Muhammad, from the tradition, I'm like, yeah, oh my God, thank God for those stories. They give me language. They give me strength. As a Christian, those stories, I say, wow. And it's such you're basically creating a corridor, creating a broad, a beautiful entrance, and say, hey, come, learn. And isn't that a wonderful part of our work together, that we can learn from one another, that we can grow? And this is the wonderful part of interfaith work, is that we have systems that we need to be working on, and we have other things, but we can all expand our own spirits and our own knowledge and our own moral understanding, and expand the strength of our moral code by learning from one another. I appreciate that. I do want to say I couldn't agree more about systems. One of the things that I think was interesting about that story, I was quoting Rabbi Lawson when I was saying that. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting about her that I think we can forget, especially in moments like this when it feels so raw and so under threat, is if we can figure out where can we identify progress and understand what it meant to get there, and understand who sacrificed to get us there, and how much we have to learn from them. And so I didn't have time to, you can hear the whole interview on State of Belief. But she was saying, my grandparents underwent such deprivation with Jim Crow. And here I am, a queer woman who can marry her partner. And so she is acknowledging that something has changed for her family. And she's not saying it's all there, because every day she experiences that it's not there. But I do want us to recognize no progress is irreparable. History shows us that. But also that progress is possible. And I think both of those things can be held hand in hand. You asked amazing questions, Andrew, and I have been very interested in the nonviolence. That is a broader civic question. The language of defeat, I get pushback about that a lot. If I didn't feel we were at an existential moment where we just can't let Christian nationalism become the dominant political force in our country, because it will mean so much harm for so many people. So I don't know what else to call it. So I get it, military, it's terrible, but I don't know what else to call it, because the stakes feel very high to me. And I have all kinds of privileges, so they're much higher for more. But they're very high, I got a family, I have a same gender partner, I have 2 boys, I feel existential threat. So I don't know what else to call it, aside from winning. But I do like the idea that we have to keep on thinking, because part of it is, how do we invite people into this other vision of America that does not need to demean them, that can be celebrating exactly who they are, but not letting that have to be me. And so I think figuring out that. The other thing that we're going to have dinner time sometime talk, because part of my work was at Princeton as the associate dean of the chapel in religious life, and a great deal of the people who I worked with were people who were not religious. I had a lot of young people, and what I always challenged them is to say, okay, so what are you? And so how do it's very easy for me, Jesus said, but they don't have that, they don't have that. If I say I'm a Christian, so I say this and this. So I was like, the submerged architecture of your worldview and your moral code, bring it above ground and share it. But how do you talk about it? Who are the philosophers? Who are the artists? Who are the poets? Who are the, who is inspiring you and creating a cohesive worldview? And bring it into these rooms and say, the secular voice, there's not going to be a secular voice, but there will be an opportunity for a secular perspective in any room. But also bring something to share. And the more that we can help young people or old people, anybody who identifies as secular, to be able to say, these are the things I hold sacred. They won't use that word. These are the things that I feel are core values for me. And I want to share those with you. And in the same way that I am learning from my Muslim sister, I'm going to learn from my secular. My greatest teacher, one of my greatest teachers is was a philosopher, was my cousin named Dick Rorty, who was like a very kind of scary secular humanist for some people. But he was really like known as this, like they would identify him particularly. He was a philosopher and then became more of a humanities professor and more interested in poetry. But he was able to articulate a vision for living a life with society and a vision for being together. And it was informed not by a religious faith, but by a broad secular worldview. And he inspired me so much. He wrote a great book called Achieving Our Country, using the language of James Baldwin, who initiated that phase. So my encouragement is come into these spaces. And we have to be more intentional about inviting people into those spaces. So that we can't assume, oh, well, we've invited everybody we could. We always need to see who's not here. And who's not at the, who's not. So that includes all sorts of other people that we might be looking at who might not be able to be in this room today, but who we would love to be part of our broader collective life together. So my hope is that these remarks are responding to the generous remarks of my colleagues and also just my deep gratitude for all of you coming out in this crazy weather and to listen to someone you've never heard of. But I just really appreciate you being here and us being part of a community together. And this is an amazing room. This is a beautiful room. This is all we really need, honestly. I mean, we need more people to join us, but this is an amazing room. So just let's relish that we're together. Let's relish that we're like seeing one another and we're part of it. And we're imagining together a future, imagining together a community that really will value everyone in this room and the people who are on the margins who didn't even know to come here tonight. So I just encourage you to relish this moment. Go enjoy some fish. I look forward to seeing you all, anybody who can come tomorrow. It's going to be very interesting. I'm just going to presage it for just a second, but I'm going to be talking about the internet. One of my passions is the internet and where it fits in technology and religion, and hate on the internet, but also the power of the internet to connect. And so that's one thing, and also interfaith advocacy and how we can come together to actually meet the needs of our communities. Much of you in this room know so much about that, but it will be an opportunity for us to have a kind of a collective experience of it. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. And again, thank you, Jim, for all of this.